In the grand halls of Thornwick Palace, where centuries of tradition echoed through marble corridors and golden tapestries told stories of ancient kings, nobody expected the most shocking royal decision in 300 years to come from the most unlikely source. Lord Commander Marcus Aldridge, a man who had spent 30 years protecting the crown without question, was about to make a choice that would reshape the entire kingdom of Valdoria forever. What started as a routine morning in the royal chambers would end with a queen losing her title, a prince ascending unexpectedly to power, and a nation questioning everything they thought they knew about loyalty, honor, and the true meaning of royal blood. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Thornwick Palace like a shroud, and Lord Commander Marcus Aldridge could feel the weight of history pressing against his shoulders as he walked through the corridors he had patrolled for 3 decades. At 55, Marcus had served under 3 monarchs, witnessed 2 coronations, and protected the royal family through countless crises. His weathered hands, scarred from battles both political and physical, gripped the sealed documents that would change everything. Queen Isabella Valdoria sat in her private chambers, reviewing the morning dispatches with her usual air of calculated elegance. Her marriage to King Edmund 5 years earlier had been met with mixed reactions from both the nobility and common folk. Some called it a love match that brought stability to the realm, while others whispered it was nothing more than a political alliance that elevated a minor duchess to the highest position in the land. Isabella's auburn hair caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows, and her emerald eyes scanned each document with the precision of someone who understood that every decision could ripple through the kingdom. Prince William Thornwick, the king's eldest son from his first marriage, stood on the palace balcony overlooking the vast gardens where he had played as a child. At 28, William possessed the natural bearing of someone born to rule, though the path to his throne had become complicated when his father remarried. The prince's dark hair moved in the morning breeze as he contemplated the strange summons he had received from Lord Commander Aldridge. In all his years, William had never been called to a private meeting with the palace guard's highest-ranking officer. The kingdom of Valdoria had prospered under King Edmund's rule, but recent months had brought troubling whispers from the noble houses. Some questioned the legitimacy of certain royal decrees, while others spoke in hushed tones about irregularities in the queen's background that had somehow escaped scrutiny during the royal courtship. Marcus had dismissed these rumors initially, but his recent investigation into palace security had uncovered documents that painted a very different picture of the woman who now wore the crown. As the palace bells chimed 9 o'clock, Marcus made his way to the queen's chambers. His boots echoed against the polished marble floors, each step bringing him closer to a confrontation that would test everything he believed about duty and justice. The guard stationed outside the queen's doors nodded respectfully as he approached, unaware that their commander was about to challenge the very foundations of royal authority. Isabella looked up from her papers as Marcus entered, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to concern as she noticed the formal documents in his hands. "Lord Commander," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent she had cultivated since becoming queen. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Marcus had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, but standing before the woman who held the second highest position in the realm, he felt the full weight of what he was about to reveal. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation, "I come to you with matters of the utmost importance regarding your position as Queen of Valdoria." The room fell silent except for the soft crackling of logs in the ornate fireplace. Isabella's hands, adorned with the royal rings of her station, slowly set down the paper she had been reading. Her emerald eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that spoke of intelligence and calculation. "Proceed, Lord Commander." Marcus opened the leather portfolio he carried and withdrew a series of documents, each bearing official seals and signatures. During a routine review of palace security protocols, I uncovered irregularities in the documentation surrounding your marriage to His Majesty King Edmund. Further investigation revealed inconsistencies in your noble lineage that were apparently overlooked during the courtship period. Isabella's face remained composed, but Marcus noticed the slight tightening around her eyes, the barely perceptible stiffening of her posture. What sort of irregularities, Lord Commander? The documents show that your claimed descent from the House of Montrose appears to be fabricated. The genealogical records have been altered, and several witnesses to your family history have provided conflicting testimonies when questioned privately. Marcus placed the first document on the ornate desk between them. More troubling still, there is evidence suggesting that you may have been aware of these discrepancies from the beginning. The Queen stood slowly, her silk gown rustling as she moved to the window overlooking the palace gardens. For a long moment, she said nothing, watching the gardeners tend to the roses that bloomed in perfect rows below. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a different quality, one that seemed to strip away years of careful cultivation. "And what do you propose to do with this information, Lord Commander?" Marcus had expected denial, perhaps even outrage. The calm acceptance in her tone surprised him and confirmed his worst suspicions. "Your Majesty, the laws of succession in Valdoria are clear. A marriage based on fraudulent claims of noble birth is invalid in the eyes of both Crown and Church. If these allegations prove true, your position as Queen would be legally void." Isabella turned from the window, and for the first time since he had known her, Marcus saw not the polished Queen, but the woman beneath the crown. "You speak of laws, Marcus, as if they were immutable forces of nature. But you and I both know that laws are made by people, and they can be unmade just as easily. Not these laws, Your Majesty. The succession laws of Valdoria have stood for 3 centuries. They have weathered wars, plagues, and political upheavals because they represent something greater than individual ambition." Marcus stepped forward, his voice gaining strength. "They represent the sacred trust between the Crown and the people." The Queen's laugh was soft but carried no humor. "Sacred trust? Marcus, you have served this palace for 30 years. In that time, have you never seen the Crown make compromises for the greater good? Have you never witnessed decisions made not because they were legally pure, but because they served the realm's needs?" Marcus thought of the countless small corruptions he had witnessed over the years, the minor deceptions and political necessities that seemed insignificant when weighed against the greater stability of the kingdom. But this felt different. This struck at the very heart of what the Crown represented. "There is a difference between compromise and fraud, Your Majesty. The people of Valdoria deserve a queen whose right to rule is legitimate and unquestioned." Isabella moved closer, and Marcus could see the intelligence and desperation warring in her eyes. "And what a stability, Marcus. What the peace we have built. King Edmund loves me, and I have served this kingdom faithfully since our marriage. Would you destroy all of that for the sake of documents and bloodlines? I would preserve it by ensuring that the Crown rests on legitimate foundations." Marcus straightened, feeling the weight of his years of service and the oath he had sworn to protect not just the royal family, but the institution of the Crown itself. "Your Majesty, I am prepared to present these findings to the Royal Council and the Archbishop. The decision of what action to take will rest with them, but my duty requires that I bring these matters to light." The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Isabella returned to her desk and sat down, her hands folding carefully in her lap. When she looked up at Marcus, her expression had changed once again, becoming something harder and more calculating. "You realize, of course, that accusations of this magnitude require absolute proof. Mere inconsistencies in old documents might be explained by clerical errors or the passage of time. If you move forward with this course of action, you'd better be certain that your evidence is unassailable." Marcus nodded grimly. "I'm aware of the standards required, Your Majesty. I would not have come to you if I were not confident in the strength of the evidence." Isabella stood once more, and this time her movement carried the full authority of her position. "Very well, Lord Commander. If this is the path you choose to walk, then we must all live with the consequences. But understand that the crown does not stand alone. There are those who benefit from the current arrangement, and they will not surrender those benefits without a fight. As Marcus left the Queen's chambers, he felt the full weight of what he had set in motion. The corridors that had been his domain for 30 years suddenly felt different, as if the very stones were watching him with suspicious eyes. He had served the crown faithfully for decades, but now he found himself in the unprecedented position of challenging the person who wore it. The prince was waiting in the library when Marcus arrived, standing before a portrait of his grandfather, the late King William III. The resemblance was striking, from the strong jawline to the thoughtful eyes that seemed to weigh every decision carefully. Prince William turned as Marcus entered, and the guard commander could see the questions written across the young man's face. "Lord Commander," William said, extending his hand in greeting, "your message suggested a matter of great urgency." Marcus had debated how much to reveal to the prince during their initial meeting. Too much information too quickly might overwhelm him, but too little might fail to convey the gravity of the situation. He had decided on a direct approach, trusting in the prince's intelligence and discretion. "Your Royal Highness, I have uncovered information that may fundamentally alter the line of succession in Valdoria. The matter concerns Queen Isabella's legitimate claim to her position and, by extension, any future claims that might stem from her marriage to your father." William's expression grew serious, and he gestured for Marcus to take a seat in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. "Please, explain what you have discovered." Over the next hour, Marcus methodically presented his findings, watching as the prince's face moved through surprise, concern, and, finally, a grim understanding of the implications. William asked thoughtful questions, requested to examine specific documents, and demonstrated the kind of careful analysis that gave Marcus hope for the kingdom's future. "If what you say is true," William finally said, setting down the last of the documents, "then my stepmother has built her entire position on a foundation of lies." "That appears to be the case, Your Highness. The question now becomes what action should be taken and who should take it." William stood and walked to the window, his gaze fixed on something beyond the palace walls. "You understand that this will create tremendous upheaval, not just for the royal family, but for the entire kingdom. There will be those who see this as an attack on the crown itself." Marcus nodded. "I have considered that possibility, Your Highness. But I believe that the crown is stronger when it stands on truth rather than deception. The people's trust in royal authority depends on their belief that the crown represents something noble and legitimate." The prince was quiet for several minutes, and Marcus could see him working through the political and personal implications of the revelation. When William finally spoke, his voice carried a new weight of responsibility. "Lord Commander, if you move forward with these accusations, you will need allies among the nobility and the church. This cannot be seen as a palace coup or a personal vendetta. It must be understood as a defense of Valdorian law and tradition." Marcus felt a surge of respect for the young man before him. Despite the personal benefit he might gain from the Queen's downfall, William was thinking first of the kingdom's stability and the proper legal processes. "I agree completely, Your Highness. I propose to present the evidence first to the Royal Council, then to the Archbishop, and, finally, to the assembled nobility. If the evidence supports the conclusions, then the proper legal channels must determine the appropriate response." William turned back to face Marcus, and the guard commander could see the future king in the young man's bearing. "Then we must proceed carefully and deliberately. The Queen will not surrender her position easily, and she has cultivated relationships with several powerful nobles who will resist any attempt to remove her." As the meeting concluded, both men understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The investigation that had begun as a routine security review had become a challenge to the very foundations of royal authority. In the hours and days that followed, the palace would become a battleground where loyalty, law, and ambition would clash in ways that neither man could fully predict. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over Thornwick Palace as Marcus made his way back to his quarters, the weight of the secret documents seeming to grow heavier with each step. Tomorrow, he would begin the formal process that could topple a queen and reshape a kingdom. Tonight, he would pray that he was making the right choice for Valdoria and its people. In her chambers, Queen Isabella stood before her mirror, removing the crown that had become the symbol of her greatest achievement and her deepest deception. The woman reflected back at her was no longer the confident queen who had awakened that morning. She was someone facing the possibility that her carefully constructed world was about to crumble around her. The game had begun, and the stakes could not be higher. The royal council chamber had not seen such tension in living memory. Ancient tapestries depicting the great victories of Valdorian kings seemed to watch from the walls as 12 of the kingdom's most powerful nobles took their seats around the massive oak table that had witnessed centuries of momentous decisions. Lord Commander Marcus Aldridge stood at the head of the table, his evidence carefully arranged before him, while Prince William occupied his traditional seat among the council members. Archbishop Benedict Thorne, a man whose silver beard and penetrating blue eyes had witnessed 5 decades of royal ceremonies, entered the chamber with the measured pace of someone who understood the gravity of formal accusations against the crown. His presence lent an air of divine authority to the proceedings, reminding everyone present that challenges to royal legitimacy were not merely political matters, but sacred ones as well. Duke Harrison Blackwood, the Queen's most vocal supporter among the nobility, sat with barely contained hostility radiating from his weathered features. His family had profited considerably from trade agreements negotiated during Isabella's reign, and he viewed any threat to her position as a direct attack on his own interests. Across from him, Lord Chancellor Edmund Fairfax maintained the neutral expression required by his position, though his sharp eyes missed nothing as he studied the documents Marcus had distributed. "Gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the vaulted chamber, "I have called this emergency session of the Royal Council to present evidence of the gravest concern regarding Her Majesty Queen Isabella's legal right to the crown of Valdoria." Duke Blackwood's fist struck the table with a sound that echoed through the chamber. "This is outrageous. Lord Commander, you overstep your authority by bringing unsubstantiated accusations against our queen. What evidence could possibly justify such a serious breach of protocol?" Marcus had expected this reaction and remained calm as he responded. "Your Grace, I understand your concern, but I ask that you reserve judgment until you have examined the evidence I am about to present. What I have uncovered goes beyond simple irregularities and suggests a systematic deception that strikes at the heart of royal legitimacy." Archbishop Thorne leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of religious authority. "Lord Commander, accusations of fraudulent royal marriage are matters that fall under both civil and canon law. If you proceed with these claims, you must be prepared to prove them beyond any reasonable doubt." "I understand completely, Your Grace." Marcus lifted the first document from his carefully organized stack. The evidence begins with inconsistencies in the genealogical records supporting Queen Isabella's claim to noble birth. According to the documents presented during her courtship with King Edmund, she claimed direct descent from Duke Alexander Montrose, whose line died out during the plague of 1847. Lord Chancellor Fairfax adjusted his spectacles and examined the documents Marcus placed before him. These records do show significant discrepancies. The dates don't align properly, and several of the witness signatures appear to have been added at different times. Duke Blackwood snatched one of the documents and studied it with growing agitation. Clerical errors and the passage of time could easily explain these inconsistencies. You cannot build a case for fraud on such flimsy evidence. Marcus had anticipated this response and was prepared with more substantial proof. "Your Grace, I wish the evidence ended with document irregularities, but my investigation uncovered much more serious deceptions." He produced a leather-bound journal and placed it carefully on the table. "This is the personal diary of Father Thomas Whitmore, who served as parish priest in the village where Queen Isabella claimed to have been born. His entries from the relevant period make no mention of any noble family residing in his parish. The chamber fell silent as the implications of this revelation settled over the assembled nobles. Archbishop Thorne reached for the journal and studied several entries carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave. Furthermore, Marcus continued, I have testimony from 3 villagers who lived in the area during Queen Isabella's claimed childhood. None recall any family matching the description she provided, and the local records show no births registered under the name she claims as her birth identity. Prince William had remained silent during the early part of the presentation, but now he spoke with careful deliberation. Lord Commander, while this evidence is certainly troubling, could there not be innocent explanations? Perhaps the Queen's family lived in relative isolation, or the records were damaged or lost over time. Marcus appreciated the prince's measured approach, which would make his next revelation even more damning. Your Royal Highness raises valid questions, and I initially hoped for such explanations myself. However, the investigation revealed evidence that Queen Isabella was not only aware of the false genealogy, but actively participated in its creation. He produced a letter bearing Isabella's distinctive handwriting, written before her marriage to King Edmund. Duke Blackwood's face grew pale as Marcus read selected passages aloud, passages that clearly indicated Isabella's knowledge that her noble claims were fabricated and her determination to maintain the deception at all costs. Archbishop Thorne studied the letter carefully, comparing the handwriting to known samples of the Queen's correspondence. This does appear to be written in Her Majesty's hand, and the content is deeply troubling. If authentic, this letter provides clear evidence of premeditated deception regarding royal succession. The atmosphere in the chamber had shifted dramatically. What had begun as skeptical resistance to Marcus's accusations was evolving into grim recognition that the evidence was substantial and damning. Lord Chancellor Fairfax removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes wearily. Lord Commander, assuming the authenticity of this evidence, what specific action are you requesting from this council? Marcus had prepared for this moment throughout his long investigation. My lords, I request that this council formally suspend Queen Isabella's royal privileges pending a complete investigation by both civil and religious authorities. If the evidence confirms these accusations, then her marriage to King Edmund must be declared invalid, and the line of succession must revert to its legitimate course. Duke Blackwood rose from his chair, his voice shaking with rage. You ask us to destroy a queen based on old documents and village gossip. The stability of this kingdom depends on respect for royal authority, not constant challenges to the crown's legitimacy. Your Grace, Prince William interjected quietly, the stability of the kingdom depends on the crown's legitimacy, not merely its authority. If the evidence shows that legitimacy was obtained through fraud, then addressing that fraud strengthens rather than weakens royal authority. The debate that followed was intense and wide-ranging, touching on legal precedents, political implications, and the practical challenges of implementing such dramatic changes. Some council members argued for a quiet investigation that would avoid public scandal, while others insisted that any action taken must be transparent and follow established legal procedures. Archbishop Thorne's voice carried special weight when he addressed the religious implications of the accusations. Gentlemen, if Queen Isabella entered into marriage with King Edmund while knowingly maintaining false claims about her background, then, in the eyes of the Church, the marriage itself may be considered invalid. This is not merely a matter of noble bloodlines, but of sacred vows taken under false pretenses. As the hours passed, the weight of evidence began to shift opinion in the chamber. Even nobles who had initially supported the Queen found themselves unable to dismiss the documentation Marcus had presented. The letter in Isabella's handwriting proved particularly damaging, as it demonstrated clear intent to deceive rather than innocent mistakes or lost records. Lord Chancellor Fairfax finally, called for a formal vote on Marcus's request to suspend the Queen's privileges pending investigation. The result was closer than Marcus had hoped, but sufficient for his purposes: 8 votes in favor, 4 opposed. The Royal Council had officially sanctioned the investigation that would determine Isabella's fate. Duke Blackwood's parting words as he stormed from the chamber carried an unmistakable threat. "You may have won this vote, Lord Commander, but do not assume that victory here guarantees victory elsewhere. Queen Isabella has friends who will not abandon her easily, and the political consequences of this action may prove more dangerous than any genealogical fraud." As the other nobles filed out of the chamber, Prince William approached Marcus with an expression of concern mixed with determination. "Lord Commander, you have set powerful forces in motion today. The Queen will not accept this decision quietly, and her supporters will use every resource at their disposal to fight back." Marcus nodded gravely. "I understand the risks, Your Royal Highness, but I believe the truth must prevail regardless of the political cost. The Crown's authority depends on its legitimacy, and legitimacy cannot be built on lies." The prince studied the documents scattered across the council table, his expression thoughtful. "There is something else we must consider, Lord Commander. If the Queen's marriage is declared invalid, it raises questions about any children she might have with my father. The succession implications could become even more complicated." This was a concern that had kept Marcus awake during many nights of his investigation. "Your Royal Highness, I pray that such complications do not arise, but if they do, we must trust in the law and the wisdom of the council to find just solutions." As evening approached, news of the council's decision began to spread through the palace corridors with the speed that only truly shocking revelations could achieve. Servants whispered in corners, guards exchanged meaningful glances, and nobles who had not attended the session sought out those who had, desperate for details about what had transpired behind the chamber's closed doors. Queen Isabella received word of the council's vote while dining privately in her chambers. The messenger who brought the news later described her reaction as surprisingly calm, though those who knew her well might have recognized the dangerous stillness that preceded her most calculated responses to threats. She dismissed her servants and sat alone at her dining table, the half-finished meal forgotten as she contemplated the battle that lay ahead. Isabella had not climbed from minor nobility to the throne of Aldoria by accepting defeat easily. She had resources that Marcus had not yet discovered, allies whose loyalty ran deeper than mere political convenience, and a will to fight that had carried her through challenges that would have destroyed lesser individuals. The game had entered a new phase, and Isabella was far from ready to concede victory to her accusers. Meanwhile, in his private study, King Edmund paced before the fireplace with the restless energy of a man whose world had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. He had loved Isabella deeply and genuinely, believing in the noble heritage she had claimed and the political alliance their marriage represented. The possibility that everything he believed about his wife might be false was almost too painful to contemplate. His closest advisor, Lord Chamberlain Geoffrey Hartwell, sat quietly in a corner chair, waiting for his king to work through the emotional turmoil that the day's revelations had created. Geoffrey had served Edmund for 15 years and had learned when to speak and when to simply be present during moments of crisis. "Geoffrey," Edmund finally said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "how did I not see this? How could I have been so thoroughly deceived by the woman I share my bed with every night?" The Chamberlain chose his words carefully. "Your Majesty, love has a way of making us see what we wish to see rather than what actually exists. If the accusations prove true, then Queen Isabella is a remarkably skilled deceiver who fooled not just you, but an entire royal court." Edmund stopped pacing and turned to face his advisor. "And if the accusations are false, if this is some elaborate scheme to destroy my marriage and destabilize the crown, then the investigation will reveal the truth, and those responsible will face the full consequences of their actions." Geoffrey paused before adding, "Your Majesty, regardless of the outcome, The royal council's decision forces you into a position where you must choose between your personal feelings and your duty to the crown. This was the heart of Edmund's dilemma. As king, he had sworn to uphold the laws and traditions of Valdoria, even when those laws conflicted with his personal desires. If Isabella had indeed deceived him about her background, then their marriage was invalid under both civil and canon law, regardless of his feelings for her. The palace had become a divided house, with loyalties shifting and alliances forming along lines that had not existed 24 hours earlier. Some courtiers rallied to Isabella's defense, viewing the accusations as an attack on royal authority itself. Others began to distance themselves from the queen, concerned about their own positions if she were to fall from grace. In the servants' quarters, conversations took on a different tone as maids and footmen who had observed the royal family's private moments shared their own observations and suspicions. Several recalled instances where the queen had seemed uncomfortable with questions about her childhood or family history, quickly changing subjects when such topics arose. The palace guards found themselves in an impossible position, sworn to protect both the king and queen while serving under a lord commander who had challenged the queen's very right to exist within the palace walls. Marcus had anticipated this conflict and spent the evening meeting with his senior officers, ensuring that their loyalty remained with their oaths and the crown itself rather than with any individual who might wear it. As midnight approached, the palace that had awakened to routine royal business had been transformed into a battlefield where truth and deception, loyalty and ambition, love and duty would clash in ways that would determine the future of the kingdom of Valdoria. The investigation that would either vindicate or condemn Queen Isabella was about to begin in earnest, and no one could predict where it would lead or who would still be standing when it reached its conclusion. The royal chambers had never felt so much like a prison to Queen Isabella as they did in the gray dawn light filtering through the tall windows. 3 days had passed since the royal council's vote, and with each passing hour, she could feel the walls of her carefully constructed world closing in around her. The servants who entered her quarters moved with a different energy now, their eyes avoiding direct contact, while their whispered conversations fell silent whenever she approached. Isabella stood before her mirror, studying the reflection that had become her greatest enemy and strongest weapon throughout her rise to power. The woman looking back at her possessed the same auburn hair and emerald eyes that had captivated a king, but something fundamental had changed. The confidence that had carried her through 5 years of royal life had been replaced by the calculating desperation of someone fighting for survival. A soft knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. "Enter," she called, her voice carrying the authority she was determined to maintain regardless of her circumstances. Lady Margaret Thornfield, her most trusted lady-in-waiting and one of the few nobles who had publicly defended her against the accusations, entered with a silver tea service. Margaret's loyalty had proven invaluable during these dark days, providing Isabella with intelligence about the investigation's progress and the shifting alliances within the court. "Your Majesty," Margaret said, setting the tea service on the ornate table near the fireplace, "I bring news from the council's continued deliberations." Isabella moved from the mirror to join her lady-in-waiting, grateful for any information about the forces arrayed against her. "What have you learned, Margaret?" "Lord Commander Aldridge has expanded his investigation beyond the original documents. He has dispatched trusted agents to the villages mentioned in your family history, and Archbishop Thorne has requested access to additional church records from the surrounding parishes." Margaret poured the tea with steady hands, though her expression betrayed her concern. "More troubling still, several nobles who previously supported you have begun to distance themselves from your cause." Isabella accepted the delicate porcelain cup and inhaled the familiar fragrance of the morning blend that had once brought her comfort. Now even simple pleasures carried the bitter taste of uncertainty. "And my husband, have you observed any changes in King Edmund's disposition toward me?" Margaret's hesitation provided the answer before she spoke. "His Majesty has become increasingly withdrawn, Your Majesty. He takes his meals in his private study and has canceled the evening walks in the garden that you used to share. Lord Chamberlain Hartwell rarely leaves his side, and their conversations are conducted in hushed tones. The pain that shot through Isabella's chest surprised her with its intensity. She had entered her marriage with Edmund for political reasons, viewing love as a pleasant bonus rather than a necessity. Over the years, however, genuine affection had grown between them, and the possibility that he might now view their entire relationship as a lie cut deeper than any legal consequence she might face. "Margaret," Isabella said, setting down her teacup with deliberate care, "I need you to arrange a private meeting with Duke Blackwood. His family's shipping interests make him vulnerable to pressure from rival houses, but his opposition to this investigation makes him our most valuable ally." Margaret nodded, understanding the unspoken implications of the request. "Shall I suggest the usual location, Your Majesty?" "Yes, but exercise extreme caution. Lord Commander Aldridge undoubtedly has agents watching my movements, and those of my supporters." Isabella moved to the window and gazed out at the palace gardens where she had once walked freely as the undisputed queen of Aldoria. It is time to remind certain people that loyalty to the crown should outweigh their fear of political consequences. As Margaret departed to arrange the clandestine meeting, Isabella allowed herself a moment of genuine emotion. The investigation had forced her to confront the reality that her entire adult life had been built on a foundation of deception. She had been born not to minor nobility, but to a merchant family whose modest success had provided education, but not the bloodline required for royal marriage. The transformation from merchant's daughter to duchess had required years of careful planning, forged documents, and the elimination of anyone who might contradict her fabricated history. She had convinced herself that the deception was justified by her genuine love for Edmund and her commitment to serving Valdoria faithfully as queen. Now, facing the possibility of losing everything she had built, Isabella found herself questioning whether the price of her ambition had been too high. The young woman who had dreamed of wearing a crown had never imagined the loneliness and constant vigilance that royal life would require. Across the palace, Prince William met with Lord Commander Marcus in the armory, a location chosen for its privacy and symbolic significance. Surrounded by the weapons and armor that had defended Valdoria for generations, both men understood that they were engaged in a different kind of battle, one where truth and justice served as their primary weapons. "Lord Commander," William said, examining a ceremonial sword that had belonged to his great-grandfather, "I have received disturbing reports about threats being made against witnesses who have provided testimony supporting your investigation." Marcus's expression darkened. He had anticipated that Isabella's supporters might resort to intimidation, but he had hoped to keep the investigation focused on evidence rather than force. "Your Royal Highness, can you provide specifics about these threats?" "Two of the villagers you interviewed have reported visits from armed men who suggested it would be healthier for them to reconsider their testimony. A third witness has disappeared entirely, though whether by choice or coercion remains unclear." William set down the sword and faced Marcus directly. "It appears that Queen Isabella has resources and allies we have not fully appreciated." This development confirmed Marcus's growing concern that the investigation had evolved beyond a simple matter of legal procedure into something approaching a palace coup. Isabella was fighting not just for her position, but for her life, and desperate people were capable of extraordinary actions. "Your Royal Highness, these intimidation tactics only strengthen the case for proceeding quickly with the formal investigation. The longer we allow uncertainty to persist, the more time our opponents have to eliminate evidence and silence witnesses." William nodded grimly. "I agree, but we must also consider the safety of those who have supported our cause. Perhaps it would be wise to provide protection for the remaining witnesses." Before Marcus could respond, a commotion in the courtyard drew their attention to the windows. A group of nobles had gathered around Duke Blackwood, who appeared to be addressing them with considerable passion. Even from a distance, the antagonistic nature of the gathering was clear. It seems that Queen Isabella's supporters are organizing their own response to the investigation, William observed. We may soon find ourselves dealing with more than legal challenges to our evidence. Marcus studied the crowd below and recognized several faces among Isabella's most vocal defenders. Your Royal Highness, I believe the time has come to accelerate our timeline. If we wait for the investigation to conclude through normal channels, we may find that political pressure, or worse, has compromised the process. William understood the implications of Marcus's suggestion. Moving quickly would mean presenting their case to the full assembly of nobles and church officials before Isabella's supporters could fully organize their opposition. It would be a high-risk strategy that could either decisively resolve the crisis or create even greater instability. Lord Commander, such haste might be seen as an attempt to rush to judgment before Queen Isabella can mount a proper defense. We must ensure that any action we take appears motivated by justice rather than political expedience. Marcus appreciated the prince's caution, but he also recognized the danger of allowing their opponents to dictate the pace of events. Your Royal Highness, I propose a compromise. Let us present our evidence to the full assembly within the week, but ensure that Queen Isabella is given every opportunity to respond to the accusations and present counter-evidence. As they finalized their strategy, neither man noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the palace's upper floors. Lady Margaret had completed her mission of arranging Duke Blackwood's meeting with the Queen, but she had also gathered intelligence about the conversation taking place in the armory below. Isabella received Margaret's report with the calm calculation that had carried her through previous crises. The knowledge that her enemies planned to accelerate their timeline actually provided her with a strategic advantage, as she now knew exactly how much time she had to implement her own counter-strategy. Margaret, she said, moving to her writing desk and withdrawing several sheets of fine parchment, I need you to deliver messages to specific individuals tonight. The content of these communications must remain absolutely confidential, and the recipients must understand that their discretion is a matter of life and death. As Isabella began writing the first letter, her handwriting flowing with the practiced elegance that had helped deceive a kingdom, she reflected on the irony that the same skills she had used to fabricate her noble identity would now serve to defend that identity against exposure. The message she crafted was a masterpiece of subtle persuasion and veiled threats, reminding the recipient of past favors received and future consequences that might result from disloyalty to the crown. She had learned during her years as queen that power was as much about perception as reality, and she intended to use every resource at her disposal to maintain the perception that she remained a formidable opponent. The second letter required even more delicate phrasing, as it was addressed to someone whose support could prove decisive but whose loyalty remained uncertain. Isabella drew upon her deepest understanding of human motivation, crafting arguments that appealed to both self-interest and genuine concern for the kingdom's stability. By the time she had completed the fifth letter, the candles in her chamber had burned low and the palace had settled into the quiet rhythms of night. Each message represented a different aspect of her strategy to survive the investigation and maintain her position as queen. Some letters promised rewards for continued loyalty, while others hinted at dire consequences for those who might consider abandoning her cause. A few appealed to higher principles of royal authority and the dangers of allowing ambitious subordinates to challenge the crown itself. As Margaret departed with the sealed letters, Isabella allowed herself a moment of satisfaction despite her precarious circumstances. She had not risen from obscurity to the throne of Valdoria by accepting defeat when faced with seemingly impossible odds. The investigation might have evidence on its side, but she had something potentially more powerful: the desperation of someone with everything to lose and the intelligence to use that desperation effectively. The palace settled into an uneasy quiet as midnight approached, but the calm was deceptive. In royal chambers and noble houses throughout the kingdom, plans were being made, and Alliances were being tested in preparation for a confrontation that would determine not just Isabella's fate, but the future direction of Valdorian monarchy. The game had evolved beyond simple questions of genealogy and legal documentation. It had become a test of wills between those who believed in the supremacy of law and those who understood that power often created its own justification. Neither side could predict with certainty how the final confrontation would unfold, but everyone involved understood that the stakes could not be higher. The crown of Valdoria, the stability of the kingdom, and the lives of those who had chosen sides in this royal drama all hung in the balance as the investigation moved toward its climactic conclusion. The Great Hall of Thornwick Palace had witnessed many historic moments throughout the centuries, but none quite like the assembly that gathered on this rain-soaked morning in late autumn. Representatives from every noble house in Valdoria filled the ancient chamber, their faces grave with the understanding that they were about to participate in proceedings that would reshape the very foundations of royal authority. Archbishop Benedict Thorne stood at the high altar that had been erected for the occasion, his ceremonial robes lending an air of divine judgment to the secular proceedings. The combination of religious and civil authority in one location emphasized the gravity of the accusations and the legitimacy of the process that was about to unfold. Queen Isabella entered the hall with the regal bearing that had served her throughout 5 years of royal life. Her emerald silk gown, chosen specifically to project confidence and authority despite her precarious circumstances. She moved to the defendant's chair with measured steps, her chin raised defiantly as she surveyed the assembled nobles who would determine her fate. King Edmund sat on his throne, but his usual commanding presence had been diminished by the emotional turmoil of recent days. The man who had ruled Valdoria with wisdom and strength now appeared aged beyond his years, the weight of having to choose between his love for his wife and his duty to the crown visible in every line of his face. Prince William occupied his traditional seat among the royal family, though his position had taken on new significance as the investigation progressed. Everyone in the hall understood that if the accusations against Isabella proved true, William would likely ascend to the throne much sooner than anyone had anticipated. Lord Commander Marcus Aldridge stood at the prosecutor's table, his evidence carefully arranged and his witnesses prepared to testify. The past week had brought additional revelations that strengthened his case, including testimony from church officials who had discovered irregularities in the marriage records and villagers who had provided sworn statements about Isabella's true background. Duke Blackwood sat with Isabella's supporters, his expression radiating hostility toward the proceedings he viewed as an attack on royal authority itself. Despite his personal loyalty to the Queen, however, even he had been shaken by some of the evidence that had emerged during the investigation's final days. Archbishop Thorne called the assembly to order, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. We are gathered today to examine accusations of the gravest nature regarding Her Majesty Queen Isabella's legal right to the crown of Valdoria. These proceedings will be conducted according to both civil and canon law, with full opportunity for both accusation and defense. Marcus rose to present his opening statement, having rehearsed the words countless times in his mind. Your Grace, Your Majesty, assembled lords of Valdoria, I stand before you today, not as an enemy of the crown, but as its defender. The evidence I will present demonstrates that Queen Isabella obtained her position through systematic deception that strikes at the very heart of royal legitimacy. He began with the genealogical evidence that had started his investigation, methodically demonstrating how Isabella's claimed descent from the House of Montrose was impossible given the historical record. Each document he presented built upon the previous revelation, creating an increasingly damning portrait of deliberate fraud. The evidence shows not merely errors or omissions, Marcus continued, producing Isabella's incriminating letter, but active participation in creating and maintaining false claims of noble birth. Her Majesty was not only aware that her genealogy was fabricated, but instrumental in ensuring that the deception would survive scrutiny. A murmur ran through the assembled nobles as the contents of Isabella's letter were read aloud. Even her supporters found it difficult to dismiss the clear evidence of premeditation contained in her own handwriting. Isabella's defense attorney, Lord Justice Henry Pemberton, rose to respond with the skill that had made him one of Aldoria's most respected legal minds. Your Grace, while these accusations appear serious on their surface, they rest upon a foundation of circumstantial evidence and questionable interpretations of old documents. The Crown deserves better than character assassination masquerading as legal procedure. Pemberton argued that the genealogical inconsistencies could be explained by the passage of time and the imperfect record-keeping of previous generations. He questioned the authenticity of some documents and the reliability of witnesses whose memories were being tested decades after the relevant events. Moreover, Pemberton continued, even if irregularities existed in Her Majesty's background, her 5 years of faithful service to Valdoria and her genuine love for King Edmund provide a foundation for royal authority that transcends questions of bloodline. The legal arguments continued throughout the morning, with both sides presenting complex interpretations of succession law and the requirements for legitimate royal marriage. The assembled nobles listened intently, understanding that their eventual vote would be based not only on the evidence presented, but on their interpretation of what was best for the kingdom's future stability. The first witness called by the prosecution was Father Thomas Whitmore's successor in Isabella's claimed birthplace, Father Michael Donovan. His testimony proved devastating to Isabella's defense, as he produced parish records showing no trace of the noble family she claimed as her ancestry. I have served that parish for 20 years, Father Donovan testified, and I have extensively researched the local history as part of my duties. There is no evidence that any branch of the Montrose family ever resided in our village, nor are there any records of births, marriages, or deaths that would support Her Majesty's claimed background. Isabella's supporters attempted to discredit Father Donovan's testimony by questioning his thoroughness and suggesting that records might have been lost or destroyed over time. However, the priest's detailed knowledge of local history and his production of comprehensive records dating back 2 centuries made their arguments appear increasingly desperate. The testimony of the villagers who had known Isabella during her actual childhood proved equally damaging. Sarah Fletcher, now an elderly woman who had served as a seamstress in the village, provided clear and detailed recollections of Isabella as the daughter of merchant Thomas Hartwell, not the noble family she claimed. I remember young Isabella quite well, Sarah testified, her voice shaking but her memory clear. She was a bright girl, always reading and dreaming of a different life. Her father was a good man who worked hard to provide for his family, but he was no nobleman. The idea that she was born to royalty is pure fantasy. Isabella's attorney attempted to discredit Sarah's testimony by emphasizing her advanced age and the possibility that her memories might be confused or unreliable. However, her detailed recollections and the corroborating testimony of other villagers created a consistent picture that contradicted Isabella's claims entirely. The most dramatic moment of the proceedings came when Marcus presented his final piece of evidence, a previously unknown letter from Isabella to her childhood friend, written shortly before her marriage to King Edmund. In this letter, Isabella explicitly acknowledged her merchant background and expressed both excitement and guilt about her successful deception of the royal court. "Dearest Anne," Marcus read aloud, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, "I can scarcely believe that my plan has succeeded so completely. Edmund truly believes that I am descended from nobility, and the court has accepted my fabricated genealogy without question. Sometimes I wonder if I'm making a terrible mistake, but my love for him and my dreams of wearing a crown have carried me past the point of return." The impact of this letter on the assembled nobles was immediate and profound. Even Duke Blackwood appeared shaken by the explicit acknowledgement of deception from Isabella's own hand. The letter provided irrefutable proof, not only of her false claims, but of her conscious decision to maintain them despite her moral reservations. Isabella remained outwardly composed during the reading of her letter, but those who observed her carefully could see the slight tremor in her hands and the tightening around her eyes that betrayed her inner turmoil. The revelation of this letter had destroyed any remaining hope that she might convince the assembly of her innocence. Lord Justice Pemberton's closing argument focused on the political consequences of invalidating Isabella's marriage rather than attempting to dispute the evidence of her deception. He argued that removing a sitting queen would create dangerous precedents and undermine the stability that Valdoria had enjoyed during Edmund's reign. Your Grace, assembled lords, we must consider not only the letter of the law, but the spirit of justice and the needs of our kingdom, Pemberton argued. Queen Isabella may have entered her marriage under false pretenses, but her conduct as queen has been exemplary. Would we destroy 5 years of successful rule and create political chaos to satisfy legal technicalities? Marcus's closing statement, however, emphasized that the rule of law was fundamental to royal authority itself. My lords, the crown derives its legitimacy not from convenience or political expediency, but from its adherence to the laws and traditions that have governed Valdoria for centuries. If we allow deception to be rewarded with continued power, we undermine the very foundations upon which royal authority rests. Archbishop Thorne called for a recess before the final deliberations, giving the assembled nobles time to consider the evidence and prepare for the vote that would determine Isabella's fate. The great hall emptied slowly, with groups of nobles gathering in corridors and side chambers to discuss the implications of what they had witnessed. Isabella used the recess to meet privately with King Edmund for the first time since the proceedings began. Their conversation, conducted in a small chamber adjacent to the Great Hall, was witnessed only by the guard stationed outside the door, but those present later described hearing both raised voices and periods of intense, whispered discussion. When the assembly reconvened, the tension in the Great Hall was palpable. Archbishop Thorne called for the formal vote on the question of Queen Isabella's legitimacy, and, one by one, the assembled nobles rose to announce their decisions. The vote was closer than Marcus had hoped, but decisive in its outcome. 37 votes for invalidating Isabella's royal status, 23 in support of maintaining her position as queen. The margin was sufficient to meet the legal requirements for such a momentous decision, but narrow enough to suggest that Isabella retained significant support despite the damning evidence against her. Archbishop Thorne's formal pronouncement carried the weight of both religious and civil authority. Based on the evidence presented and the judgment of this assembly, I hereby declare that the marriage between King Edmund and Isabella Hartwell was entered into under false pretenses and is therefore invalid under both canon and civil law. Isabella Hartwell's claim to the title of Queen of Valdoria is hereby revoked. The words echoed through the great hall like thunder, marking the end of Isabella's reign and the beginning of a new chapter in Valdorian history. Isabella remained seated throughout the pronouncement, her face showing no emotion despite the magnitude of what she had lost. King Edmund rose slowly from his throne, his voice heavy with exhaustion and pain as he addressed the assembly. Lords of Valdoria, I accept the judgment of this assembly and acknowledge that my marriage to Isabella was founded upon deception. However, I also acknowledge that she served our kingdom faithfully during her time as queen, and I ask that she be granted safe passage from the realm rather than facing further punishment. The generosity of Edmund's request surprised many in the assembly, demonstrating that despite his sense of betrayal, he retained genuine affection for the woman who had deceived him. His request was granted by acclamation, with even some of Isabella's opponents recognizing the wisdom of allowing her to leave quietly rather than creating additional political complications. As the formal proceedings concluded, Isabella rose from her chair and walked from the great hall with the same regal bearing she had maintained throughout the ordeal. She spoke to no one and acknowledged no one, leaving behind the crown and the life she had fought so desperately to preserve. The hall erupted in conversations as nobles discussed the immediate implications of the decision and began positioning themselves for the changes that would inevitably follow. Prince William found himself surrounded by well-wishers and advisors eager to ingratiate themselves with the man who would likely soon become their king. Outside the palace, word of Isabella's downfall spread quickly through the kingdom. Some citizens expressed shock at the revelation that their queen had been living a lie, while others claimed they had always suspected something was amiss about her sudden rise to power. As evening approached, the palace began to settle into new rhythms that reflected the dramatic changes in royal authority. Isabella's chambers were sealed, and her personal effects prepared for removal, while Prince William met with his father to discuss the transition of power that would soon take place. The investigation that had begun with routine document review had culminated in one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in Valdorian history. A merchant's daughter who had successfully deceived the kingdom for 5 years had finally been exposed, and the crown would now pass to its rightful heir. The game had reached its conclusion, but the consequences of Isabella's deception would continue to reverberate through the kingdom for years to come. The dawn that broke over Thornwick Palace brought with it a profound transformation that extended far beyond the simple changing of rulers. Prince William stood at the window of what had been his father's private study, watching as the last of Isabella's belongings were loaded into a simple carriage that would carry the former queen away from the life she had fought so desperately to preserve. Isabella emerged from the palace for the final time, wearing a plain traveling dress that bore no resemblance to the elaborate gowns that had marked her years as queen. Her auburn hair was covered by a modest hood, and she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had accepted defeat, but refused to be broken by it. The transformation from queen to exile was complete, yet something in her bearing suggested that this might not be the end of her story. King Edmund watched from his own window as the woman he had loved departed from his life forever. The pain in his weathered features reflected not only personal loss, but the broader realization that his judgment had been fundamentally flawed in the most important decision of his reign. The king who had ruled Valdoria with wisdom and strength for 2 decades had been thoroughly deceived by the person closest to him. Lord Chamberlain Geoffrey Hartwell stood beside his king, offering the silent support that had sustained Edmund through many previous crises. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "the council awaits your pleasure regarding the formal transition of power to Prince William." Edmund turned from the window, his shoulders straightening as he prepared to fulfill what might be his final significant act as king. "Summon my son, Geoffrey. It is time to complete the process that began with Lord Commander Aldridge's investigation." The formal ceremony transferring power from Edmund to William took place in the throne room, with the same nobles who had voted to depose Isabella now witnessing the elevation of her stepson to the crown. Archbishop Thorne performed the abbreviated coronation ritual that tradition required when succession occurred under exceptional circumstances. Prince William knelt before the throne where his father had ruled for 20 years, accepting the crown and scepter that represented not just power, but the enormous responsibility of healing a kingdom damaged by deception and political upheaval. At 28, he was younger than most kings at their coronation, but the crisis that brought him to power had also prepared him for the challenges he would face. "William of the House Thornwick," Archbishop Thorne intoned, "do you solemnly swear to rule the kingdom of Valdoria with justice and wisdom, to protect its people from harm, and to uphold the laws and traditions that have governed this realm for centuries?" "I do so swear," William replied, his voice carrying clearly through the throne room and marking his transformation from prince to king. The assembled nobles who had participated in Isabella's downfall now pledged their loyalty to the new king, understanding that their own futures would depend largely on how successfully William could restore stability and unity to a divided kingdom. Even Duke Blackwood, who had supported Isabella until the end, knelt before the new king and offered his allegiance. Lord Commander Marcus Aldridge found himself in an unusual position as the ceremony concluded. His investigation had exposed a queen's deception and elevated a prince to power, but he took no satisfaction in the political victory his actions had achieved. His motivation had always been the preservation of royal legitimacy rather than personal advancement, and he hoped that history would judge his choices as necessary rather than ambitious. King William's first official act was to address the assembled nobles about his plans for healing the divisions created by the investigation and trial. "Lords of Valdoria," he began, his voice carrying the authority that came with legitimate power. "We have passed through a time of great testing that has challenged our understanding of royal authority and personal loyalty. Moving forward, we must focus not on the deceptions of the past, but on building a future worthy of our kingdom's great traditions." The new king's speech emphasized reconciliation rather than retribution, understanding that the kingdom's stability required former opponents to become allies rather than continuing enemies. He pardoned those who had supported Isabella's cause, recognizing that their loyalty to the crown itself had been genuine, even if misguided. However, William also made clear that the standards for royal conduct and noble behavior would be elevated to prevent future deceptions. "The crown's authority depends on the trust of the people," he declared, "and that trust can only be maintained through absolute honesty in all matters of royal succession and noble privileges." As the formal ceremonies concluded and the nobles departed to spread news of the transition throughout the kingdom, William found himself alone with the enormous responsibility of ruling a realm that had been shaken to its foundations. The crown that now rested on his head felt heavier than he had anticipated, weighted with the expectations of a people who deserved better than the deception they had unknowingly lived under for 5 years. The immediate challenges facing the new king were both practical and symbolic. Isabella's supporters, while pardoned, remained potentially disloyal elements within the nobility who might oppose his rule or seek to undermine his authority. The common people, while generally accepting of the transition, harbored questions about how their former queen could have deceived an entire kingdom for so long. More troubling still were the international implications of Isabella's exposure. Foreign diplomats and rival kingdoms had observed Valdoria's internal crisis with great interest, and some might interpret the political upheaval as a sign of weakness that could be exploited. William would need to demonstrate strength and competence quickly to discourage any aggressive moves by neighboring powers. The former king, Edmund, had chosen to retire to a countryside estate rather than remaining at court, where his presence might complicate his son's reign. The decision reflected both his personal need to recover from Isabella's betrayal and his understanding that successful transitions of power required former rulers to step aside completely. In his final private conversation with William before departing for retirement, Edmund offered the wisdom gained from 2 decades of rule and the bitter lessons learned from his disastrous marriage. "My son," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "trust is the foundation of all royal authority, but it must be earned through consistent action rather than accepted based on appearances or personal feelings." William absorbed his father's advice, while also recognizing that his own reign would need to be different from Edmund's in fundamental ways. The crisis that brought him to power had demonstrated the dangers of placing too much trust in individuals, while too little emphasis on verification and accountability. Lord Commander Marcus Aldridge submitted his resignation shortly after William's coronation, feeling that his role in exposing Isabella made it inappropriate for him to continue serving as the palace's chief security officer. However, the new king refused to accept the resignation, understanding that Marcus's commitment to truth and legal authority made him more valuable, not less, in the aftermath of the crisis. "Lord Commander," William said during their private meeting, "your actions saved this kingdom from the continuation of a fundamental deception. I need advisors who will tell me difficult truths rather than comfortable lies, and you have proven your willingness to do exactly that." Marcus accepted the king's decision while also requesting additional resources for background investigations and security protocols that would help prevent future deceptions. The investigation that had exposed Isabella had revealed numerous weaknesses in the palace's ability to verify claims and detect sophisticated fraud. The kingdom's response to Isabella's exposure and William's ascension varied significantly across different regions and social classes. The nobility generally supported the new king, understanding that stable succession served their interests better than continued political uncertainty. However, some nobles privately questioned whether the investigation had been necessary or beneficial for the kingdom's long-term stability. The merchant classes, particularly those who had benefited from trade policies implemented during Isabella's reign, worried that the new king might reverse economic reforms they had found profitable. William's early proclamations emphasized continuity in successful policies while promising greater oversight and accountability in royal decision-making. Common citizens throughout Valdoria displayed a mixture of fascination and concern about the dramatic events at court. Many expressed amazement that a merchant's daughter had successfully posed as nobility for so long, while others worried about what other deceptions might exist within the royal court or noble houses. Religious leaders generally supported the new king, while also using Isabella's downfall as an opportunity to emphasize the importance of honesty and moral conduct in positions of authority. Archbishop Thorne's sermons during the weeks following the transition focused on the divine requirement for truth in leadership and the dangers of allowing ambition to override moral obligations. International reactions to Valdoria's political crisis ranged from curious observation to opportunistic positioning. Some neighboring kingdoms expressed concern about the stability of their diplomatic relationships with Valdoria, while others began quietly exploring whether the transition might create opportunities for territorial or economic advantages. The diplomatic corps faced the delicate task of reassuring foreign powers that Valdoria remained a stable and reliable partner, while also explaining how such a significant deception had remained undetected for so long. King William's early diplomatic initiatives focused on demonstrating continuity in foreign policy and competence in domestic governance. One of the most complex challenges facing the new king was the question of what to do about policies and decisions made during Isabella's reign. While her queenship had been declared invalid, the practical reality was that she had participated in numerous governmental decisions that had shaped the kingdom's development over 5 years. William chose a pragmatic approach, evaluating each policy on its merits rather than automatically reversing everything associated with Isabella's influence. This decision reflected both practical necessity and his understanding that wholesale changes could create more instability than they resolved. The legal precedents established by Isabella's case would influence Valdorian succession law for generations. The investigation and trial had clarified the requirements for legitimate royal marriage and the procedures for challenging claims of noble birth. These precedents would make future deceptions more difficult, while also providing clear guidelines for addressing similar situations. As winter approached, King William had successfully navigated the immediate challenges of his unexpected ascension to power. The kingdom had achieved a new equilibrium that balanced justice for past deceptions with pragmatic recognition of the need for stability and continuity. The crisis that had threatened to tear Valdoria apart had ultimately strengthened its institutions and clarified its values. The final chapter of Isabella's story remained unwritten as her carriage disappeared beyond the kingdom's borders. Whether she would attempt to rebuild her life in exile or seek some form of revenge against those who had exposed her deception would become clear only with the passage of time. For King William, Lord Commander Marcus, and the people of Valdoria, the immediate crisis had concluded, but its lessons would continue to shape their understanding of power, truth, and the responsibilities that came with both. The crown that had been won through deception now rested on legitimate foundations, and the kingdom faced the future with hard-earned wisdom about the price of placing appearance above reality. The throne room that had witnessed Isabella's downfall and William's coronation stood empty as evening approached, its ancient stones having absorbed another chapter in the long history of royal power. The crown of Aldoria had survived its greatest test in centuries, emerging stronger for having faced and overcome the challenge of fundamental deception at its very heart. The game was over, but the kingdom would remember its lessons for generations to come.